to debating economics. And what's interesting about this title I've chosen is that you can read it both as economics for debating, but also debating economics. Yeah, I know. This session is going to be packed full of such instances of wit and entertainment, so get ready. So, starting off, the way I'm going to do this is mostly by talking through concepts. By all means, that doesn't mean you should let me talk uninterrupted if you want to interrupt me. Ideally for a relevant reason, like, can you explain this, or what did that mean, or what about this other thing that is relevant to your presentation? I really welcome questions. It's just that I basically didn't have the time to plan this as a kind of interactive activity. So, for a quick thing about me, I was at Imperial last year. We don't show you this part. It was at Imperial. This is my 5th year of university debating. Like every broken clock, it's sometimes correct, and so sometimes I do well in debates, and more often in econ debates than others. So I thought I should talk about it. But I'm by no means an expert. I've done a little bit of economics at school and a little bit for my master's. Definitely didn't actually study it. But you don't need to in order to do well in debates about economics. If anything, knowing too much means you get too technical. That can often put you at a disadvantage. So with that out of the way, the first thing I want to clarify and sort of chat about is, when might a debate be about economics? Or more to the point, when can you insert economic analysis into a particular debate? Because, it sounds, when we say there's an econ motion, or Nick's going to talk about economics and debating, it sounds like, motions about the economy, stuff about what the central bank should do, whether or not we should nationalize a particular industry, or something like that. Whether or not capitalism is good. But really, there's small elements of economics in the vast majority of motion topics at the very least, and usually in a lot of the motions that you'll see at your average tournament. Obviously not all of them, but within the sort of standard things we debate, like social policy, criminal justice, a lot of IR, but also things related to the environment and even art. There's a lot of things relating to economics that you can chat about. It's not always going to be the main thing that's in a debate. It's not always going to be the thing that's relevant on your side. It's not always going to be the reason why you'll win, but often it might be. And so the reason why I want to start off with this is just so you're aware that the stuff I'm going to be talking about doesn't relate exclusively to motions that you can brand in your head as, this is an economics motion. So rather it's about sort of getting familiar with a few tools, a few frameworks or theories or concepts that you can then apply to do well in debates. And I'll try and give examples of where that might be the case as I go through. So, first off, free markets. This might seem like a very basic question, but I think it's a good starting point. Like, why is it that we have markets? Or what is a market? It's a very nebulous concept that can mean lots of different things. But in the abstract, it's about the place where goods and services are traded, where people exchange different things with one another. In some cases, it's individuals trading with one another. In others, it might be an individual versus a corporation or some government entity. It might be governments trading with one another. But the general idea is that markets allow a more efficient distribution of things. So if I have a lot of meat, but I don't really need all of it, and there's other people that need meat and have things that I want, it's a better situation after we engage in a few trades, and so we're all left with a little bit less of what we initially had, but a little bit more of the other things that we needed and didn't have. And in some ways we can call that a more efficient system. I'm not going to go into the different types of efficiency and the more technical stuff that an actual economist would, because it's not so useful here. It's more of a distraction. The second thing that's important about markets is that it's a place where different people get to evaluate the actual value of different things. And to different people, something might be worth different. But importantly, it's an overall system in which usually there's some degree of transparency of, how much is this thing actually worth? And you'll see why this is useful in a sec. But first, I want to draw this distinction of different types of economies or economic systems, which is useful, but is mostly useful so that we can then focus on one and look at it in detail. So in general, I think the best way to think of this is that as a spectrum, where on the one extreme you've got a free market economy, where things are purely privately owned. Government is only there to sort of uphold the law, to uphold property rights, to ensure that people engage within the market fairly. But other than that, everything is allocated through people buying and selling stuff, through the price that different things will have. And on the other side of the spectrum, you've got a command economy, a sort of Soviet-style arrangement where the government controls everything. The government decides how much is produced, what is produced, when is it produced, and who is it given to. But neither of those is a system that is sort of realistic. In reality, the vast majority of countries have a mixed economy where some things are owned by the government, some things are owned by the private sector. And the mixed economy can be, two totally different things, depending on what the proportion of things is that is owned by the private sector, but also qualitatively, what are those things? What we're going to be talking about, at least for now, is free markets. Not necessarily a completely free market economy, but just the idea of a free market, what is good about it, then what's bad about it. But even though in some cases, to some extent, I'm going to be talking about something that is largely theoretical, it's still useful, right? Because in a lot of debates about economics or other things, it's often about a certain contrast between who should own or who should control something. Should it be the government or should it be left up to individuals in the private sector? And so while on the side that says it shouldn't be the government, we shouldn't nationalize something, or we shouldn't extend the reach of government further, you're not necessarily defending, total libertarian anarcho-capitalism, but you're still defending the general principles upon which we build the free market, even though you might concede that, there should be some government control, that maybe, healthcare should be controlled by the government, but not these other industries. It is for reasons that I want to go through now. So the first broad thing to look at is this thing called opportunity cost and comparative advantage. So opportunity cost is just the cost of me doing something. So if I'm going to spend £1,000 to buy a MacBook, that means that those £1,000 cannot be spent on me buying other things. So the and when evaluating whether or not I should spend my £1,000 or 10 hours of work doing X or doing Y, you're comparing the theoretical cost of one versus the other. And in general, by doing that, we figure out, or people or companies or countries figure out what is the most beneficial thing to do, where is it most efficient in our minds to devote our money, to devote our resources, to, do that thing. This probably doesn't make much sense right now, but I'm going to illustrate it through an example. And if it doesn't after that, well, then I'll have to improvise. So here's David. You might know him. He's a footballer or something. But what we care about right now is how good he is at mowing his lawn. So David can do that in 2 hours. It's pretty good. I mean, he has a pretty big house, so that's quite impressive. But here's the thing. He could also spend those 2 hours on a photo shoot. And, I mean, I personally just don't find him attractive. But other people do. And he can make $10,000 as a result. So we can for now say that the opportunity cost of cutting his grass is $10,000, because let's assume for the time being that those are his only two choices, and so this one being more valuable is the one that is the trade-off against the first one. Meet Scotty, David's neighbor. Now, he's not as good at mowing lawn. He'd need 4 hours to go through David's mansion and cut all that grass. He could also do something else. So his second, and let's assume for the time being, only other choice would be to work at McDonald's, which pays you $8 an hour. So for the 4 hours it would take him to mow David's lawn, he could be making $32 at McDonald's. So, quick straw poll, or just think about this in your heads. Seeing as David is twice as productive, can cut grass twice as quickly as Scotty, should he mow his own lawn? Does anyone think yes? Does anyone think no? Okay, some people think no. Most people think no. Yeah, you're right. Even though David has what we call an absolute advantage at cutting grass, relatively speaking, it wouldn't make any sense for him to do that, because, I mean, sure, he gets to cut his grass quicker, he gets to save on the salary of someone to cut his grass, but he could have been making so much more doing this other thing. So in that arrangement, it would be much more efficient for him to just pay Scotty, well, not $32, but perhaps a little bit more to incentivize him to work for him rather than McDonald's. And then he can do his commercial, and he'll have made so much more money as a result. Now, obviously, this is a very extreme example where the correct answer is obvious. In other cases, it's, you need to do a little bit more math to figure it out, or you need to make a few more qualitative judgments. But in general, that's the first idea. I think it underlies why markets are a useful thing, or why people specializing in different things is something that's useful. Why one country producing cars, even though it could have been efficiently producing food at the same time, other agricultural goods. Instead, it lets poorer countries that are less good at producing advanced goods like cars do that. And instead it focuses on the thing that has the higher opportunity cost. So, and in this situation, the other really important thing to realize, and it is quite useful when debating, when defending the free market, is that both people are better off. I mean, sure, it might seem unfair that Scotty is making so much less money for his time compared to David, but had it not been for David offering him $50, he'd have been making $32. So that's the other essential part of free market. It's that people consensually opt into situations, and they do so because not doing so would be against their interests. So obviously, when you're critiquing that, you can talk about how people might be coerced into transactions, how the capitalist system might be brainwashing you into wanting things, so you think you're better off, but you're not actually. But in general, it's very difficult to show that no such thing as free choice exists. The general principle of free markets, of voluntary transactions, is that people enter into them, become better off as a result, and they enter more transactions, then they become even further better off. And that's quite useful. And something that very often teams forget in debates, and you're sitting in closing thinking, this is not a deep motion, the opening government's going to take it all, and then opening government make, arguments about identity or discourse or something else, and you're like, wow, they left all the low-hanging fruit. That's so easy, so easy to grab. And that's because a lot of people just don't engage with economics, think I didn't do this at school or at uni, kind of afraid of it, I'm just going to accept that I'll come forth in economics debates or try and make economics debates about something else. But really, it's quite easy not to do that. It's quite easy because a lot of economic arguments are just about, making small logical, linking small logical claims together, and then you've proven the thing, as opposed to more complex arguments where you've, instead of proven it, suggested that things perhaps might be like this for a small number of people that think in that way. So I think oftentimes arguments that are rooted in more economic analysis than other things are more easy to make plausible, which is half the battle in terms of winning a debate. You need to establish your arguments as plausible and then also as relevant and impactful. And so if it's easy to make something plausible, that's an argument that is tactically wise to select. So the second thing about free markets is price. Price and the kind of profit incentives that putting a price on something might create, instead of letting people have things for free or trading it without having some kind of relative value attached to it. So the price is determined in simple terms by the supply and demand for something. I mean, I was going to go to Inner Temple this weekend, and I had paid £60 for the registration. I can't make it anymore, and I know that if I post on the Facebook event saying, anybody want to buy my registration fee? It was £60. I mean, for starters, if anybody does, they can just go to the convener and say, can I have a team? Here's £60. But for other reasons, they might also choose not to. If they were planning to go to that tournament, they'd have done so already. They'd have paid the £60. So what I did just before coming here is I posted on the event and I said, anybody want to buy my team slot? I'm going to sell it to you for £40, which means that I get to lose 20, but at least if someone says yes, I've not lost the full 60. And the reason why I did that is because there was very little demand for that. I had already messaged a few friends. None of them were interested in paying £60 to speak at Inner Temple. It's just quite expensive. But at least in my head, I'm thinking, okay, not everyone can afford to pay £60 to spend a weekend debating, but maybe some people can afford £40 because, it's not as outrageous a fee, though it's still quite expensive. Now, if there had been a lot more people wanting to get a team spot, say if there was a waiting list already, people were couldn't wait to pay £60 to Inner Temple to go debate there, then I'd have no reason to charge less, right? If anything, I'd have a reason to charge more because there's a lot more supply, i.e. more than zero, that there previously was, and there's quite a few people interested in getting that team spot. So I hope this example, while a bit personal and odd, kind of highlights what it might be that determines the price of stuff, at least in a very general kind of sense. And again, in a very general kind of sense, when we talk about profit, we talk about the difference between the cost of producing something or acquiring something and the actual price you sell it for. So, in my case, for Inner Temple, it's minus 20. It's not a very good profit margin. Indeed, most people wouldn't think that is a good deal. Except, again, remember that my opportunity cost of not selling this ticket is 60 or minus £60. So actually, if I manage to sell it, I'll be £40 better off, even though in absolute terms I've still lost money. So profit is quite useful, and often is the specific thing we talk about in debates. A lot of debaters think that if they establish that a particular actor, like a private corporation, has a profit incentive, that counts as an argument, and more importantly, it counts as a harm. Then you're sitting there thinking, what? Like, since when is having a profit incentive a bad thing? I can think of ways in which it might be a bad thing, but you need to explain those. But also, again, because a lot of people are very afraid of economics and afraid of even thinking, could Karl Marx be wrong about certain things? No, never. Again, they will glance through through that material or not be able to rebut it effectively. So the reason why profit is useful is for a couple of reasons. It has to do with the kind of incentives that it creates. The first incentive that it creates is the incentive to compete. If Bruce has set up a business selling garlic bread, and is making 3 times the money he's actually paying for the bread and the garlic and the oil and the butter, he buys all that stuff wholesale. It's really cheap. And then he sells it as premium garlic bread and charges you £15 per piece. Firstly, good for Bruce, right? He's making money. And presumably he's also making people happier. Otherwise, they wouldn't want to lose that £15 in return for a piece of bread. But the important thing there is that Bruce has found an opening in that market, but that others are free to move in if it's a free economy. If it's a regulated economy, if the government says there can only be one person selling here and that person we've selected is Bruce, Maybe because Bruce bought the rights to do that. Maybe because Bruce is the son of the local government leader. In a freer system, that wouldn't be the case, right? So if I wanted to go and say, you know what, I will set up a garlic bread store as well. I'm going to charge $14 or 14 pounds for each piece. And then people would start coming to me because they could get, let's assume it's the same quality of garlic bread, they could get the same thing just a bit cheaper. So obviously they'd come to me. And of course, a market is a dynamic system, right? Things change over time and in response to other stuff. So if Bruce sees that, I mean, what's Bruce going to do? He's going to cut his prices more. Or he's going to say, well, my premium garlic bread is even better. You should come to me and pay more because it's just worth that much, that additional money. And so in general, when that profit incentive exists, when different competitors have the incentive either to improve the quality of what they're selling or cut the price so that they're still making above the cost, but it's cheaper, or maybe the incentive to cut their costs in order to be able to go further down. All of those different incentives are in the name of making profit, right? Or in the name of maximizing what that little number at the end of that subtraction is. It means that essentially the bottom line is that things become cheaper for people, they become more abundant, and they usually become better. That's why, when telephony was something owned by the government, in part because technology was really poor compared to now back then, but also in part because there was no competition. It was terrible, right? You had to wait weeks or months in order to get a landline connected to your house. It was really expensive. Often, things would break, the signal would break up. Whereas now, at least in some ways, it's cheaper, right? It's cheaper, it's more efficient. Obviously, technological improvements have played a big part in that. But if you compare, for example, internet and phone connections, phone companies in the UK versus those of the US, you see that things in the US are, one, much worse, and two, a lot more expensive. Or at least if you roughly knew what the situation there was, you would know that. For now, you have to take my word for it. And the reason why that is because there's a lot less competition there because of the way that the government has sold off rights, and different companies sort of have their own local monopolies where within a particular state there's only one or two companies selling internet because they control those lines. And so other players can't come in and say, here, I can offer something cheaper, or I can offer internet that doesn't cut off all the time, or that isn't super, super slow. Did you have a question?
That is okay, you answered it.
Oh, okay. And then the second thing that I kind of touched upon, the kind of broad category of things that the profit incentive incentivizes different companies to do, is essentially to invest. And this is quite useful, right? Because oftentimes, in order for something to be good, you just need to throw a lot of money at it, right? So, yes, it's not ideal that large corporations get to drill oil and they get to make the money for that instead of the people, whose land is in that country. It's not ideal that the government can claim all that oil and then use the proceeds to give nice stuff to people. But equally, drilling oil is a very risky and very expensive kind of business, right? It's very likely that once you start drilling in order to see if there's oil down there, which is a process that is incredibly expensive and needs a lot of very talented people, it's very likely that you'll come up dry, right? And that there's going to be nothing there, or that it's going to be so deep that it costs more for you to drill it out than to sell it. Yet a lot of companies are specifically invested in doing that, right? And they're engaged in oil exploration. And that is because while there's a risk of failure, there's also a risk of success. And at the end of that success, the payoff can be quite high, right? Similarly, a lot of people are very pissed off at Martin Shkreli, who's the guy who charged, I don't remember which drug he bought, but he bought this drug, I think it was related to cancer, therapy and is now charging an extortionate price for it. And people are like, how is it okay to make thousands of dollars for a pill that costs you mere cents to produce? How is it okay to profit out of people's need for medicine? And you're like, yeah, how is it okay? But really the issue of the pharmaceutical industry is a little bit more complex, right? So to develop the drug that in the end, once you've perfected your formula, only costs a few cents to actually mass produce, you need to invest billions of dollars. You need to invest billions of dollars into clinical trials. You need to invest billions of dollars into more long-term studies to get FDA approval. But also, even before that, you need to invest lots and lots of money and time and scientific effort and hire the best scientists to do that in order to just test different variations of different formulas in order to figure out which one actually has an effect. And most of them fail. Most of them will fail either at that initial stage or at the clinical trial phase or at the preclinical trial phase or in the phase 2 clinical trial phase. There's lots and lots of different stages through which a drug may have to go. Because, sure, it might cure cancer, but the necessary dose may be such that it kills any person that might take it. So obviously that drug is useless. Things like that means that in order to develop those drugs, you need to first invest tons of money. And the thing with all that investment is that because there's such a high chance of failure, because most projects end up failing, there's a high chance of you losing that money. So essentially, it doesn't cost $100,000 to do the research and development for this drug. Instead, it costs $2 billion because you need to add all the costs of all the other drugs that you tried to test and failed because you're only going to make money off this one. So that's the reason why we grant companies patents, and specifically pharmaceutical companies enjoy patents that have very long duration and a lot of protections, because that is the only way that anyone would do it, right? Because why would a private company invest billions of dollars, produce the drug, but then the drug is open to anyone to mass produce, given that, other competitors can then move in and produce the same drug without any of the billions of dollars in costs. Instead, their only cost is, the dollar it takes to produce that drug in a factory. So if there wasn't that profit incentive, sure, maybe some billionaire would donate a lot of money. Maybe some governments would have the excess money to spend on that research. But overall, the total amount of money that would go into pharmaceutical development would be much, much lower, right? And that is another general reason why having things exist in the private sphere, why having things be possible to make a profit out of selling or developing can be a good thing, right? Because it incentivizes people to do it. As a more simple example, why do people migrate for economic reasons, right? They do it because there's better economic opportunities somewhere else, but essentially that means they're going into places where their skills are more desired, right? It means that, if British people are terrible at repairing sinks, or they just don't want to do it, maybe, like David, their opportunity cost of doing that is just too high to be worth it. But there's lots of Polish people that in their country make much less money, that have the right skills, they have the willingness to do it. They migrate to the UK not because the food is better, not because it's cheaper to eat here, but rather because that's where their skills are desired. So again, markets are the thing which gets people to just generally do stuff, right? It's the reason why Benjamin is going to become a banker. Admittedly, he'll donate most of his money to charity, right? But he'll do that over just running his own charity because the market will pay him more to do that, because the market desires people to be bankers more than it desires people to run charities. Because there's further payoffs as a result of that for some, we vilify bankers, but they're sometimes useful at ensuring those efficient kind of transactions, that money flows in the right places, that investment is going into pharmaceutical companies rather than other things that have a much lower return on investment and therefore benefit fewer people. Do things make sense up until here? Great. I've kind of touched on this essentially, but in debates very often you'll have to defend various types of market mechanisms. And oftentimes those market mechanisms or free market mechanisms are quite openly what the motion is about, right? It could be this house would create a free market for the sale of babies. Very common motion is legalize the private sale of organs. Like, what might be the reason why you'd legalize the private sale of organs? I mean, it sounds really weird, right? Like, what, cutting people open and taking their organs and selling it for money? Why might we want to legalize that kind of transaction?
Improve the supply of organs.
Yeah, exactly. There's a criminally low amount of organs flowing, through the NHS and through the general organ market right now, because it's mostly based through donations. And it's just difficult to get those donations in the first place because it requires someone dying, but dying with their organs being healthy. So, maybe this would incentivize more people to opt into wanting to have their organs harvested when they die. Or it might mean things like, I don't really need 2 kidneys, I can just sell one off. Iran is, as far as I know, the only nation to have done this. And it's weird, right? Because you don't necessarily think of Iran as the place that would be ahead of us when it comes to this stuff. But they are, right? And Iran has essentially eliminated their patient waiting list for a lot of organs because enough people do it so that no one gets to die or live a miserable life for not having one. Again, like similar reasons for the other motions, but I want to move on. But it might be useful to make a note of them and think, why might this be a useful idea purely from the kind of market standpoint that we've been discussing so far? Obviously, there's lots of other arguments within all of these motions, but oftentimes, like, I've seen teams have a motion like that, like the organ one, and opening government will go up and they'll talk about lots of things, except we will increase the supply. And then you go up from closing government, you're like, this is really awkward, because I'm kind of going to say 2 sentences and win the debate that's happened so far. And you'll do, right? Because people will often skip those really important arguments. Market failure. So turns out that there's actually quite a few problems with markets, or at least problems that occur in particular markets. I'm going to go through them, and we're going to look at exactly what might those be. Essentially, this can be viewed as a sort of critique on free markets, though from an economics point of view rather than a moral point of view, or a more, I guess, social point of view. So, the first one is externalities, and really most of these problems fall under the broad category of externalities. So, an externality is when I make a trade with you, but it has some accidental effect on other people who are not involved in the trade. So, if you think back to what I was talking about earlier, that the reason why we like voluntary transactions is that because all the parties that are involved consent into it because that transaction makes them better off. Well, sometimes people enter into transactions, but there's a third party that doesn't consent into that transaction, that doesn't get compensated for it, yet is left worse off, or in some cases better off and hasn't paid for it. Can someone think of an example of where this might be the case, where 2 people, 2 countries, 2 individuals, generally speaking, 2 actors engage in a transaction, but then someone else gets to bear an additional cost or an additional benefit? Yeah.
You create a Wi-Fi linked security camera to sell to a customer so they can watch parts of their house while at work. But to keep it cheap, you don't invest in proper security safeguards because the customer doesn't want it because it doesn't care. So a hacker goes and uses that as part of a DDoS against Google and takes it.
I mean, it might fit the general definition I gave, but it's not strictly speaking something inherent in that transaction, right? Because then I, as the customer, can sue that company and say, you didn't sell me a secure system. Or maybe I bought it knowing it's not secure. I'm thinking of a slightly... Yeah.
I was number one.
Like the example mentioned environmental damage. So when like a chemical plant produces chemicals, but then it doesn't follow like the environmental regulations, or there are none, and they dump all that toxic like chemicals in the river, and then people down the river drink that water and die.
Yep. That's the, like, generally environmental harms, the most easy and commonly cited instance of an externality. I would also suggest an instance of a public or a positive externality. So, I am an immigrant. Let's forget the bit where I'm now working and paying tax in this country. Up until I was doing that, I'd be in this country and, for example, benefit from the existence of the NHS, even though I wasn't actually paying for it. Or, I'm an EU citizen, so maybe that example doesn't fully count. You go to a different town where you don't pay council tax, you have not contributed anything there, but you really like it. It has these old buildings, this really nice view, there's a lot of street artists, and you generally feel better off just by being there, even though you haven't paid anything for that kind of feeling. The air is really clean, and everyone around you sort of smiles at you and makes you feel happy. Yet a lot of the reason why that is because that local council is actually really well funded, really well organized. People pay a lot of council tax, but in return, the roads are kept clean and the air is safe, and all the houses that are really pretty take a lot of money to maintain. So in some ways, you've benefited from other people spending money on these things, even though you didn't pay any of it. Or a broader and general example that might make more sense in the context of what we were discussing earlier. The army and a lot of other things that the government essentially funds for us gets to benefit everyone within those borders, right? The fact that there exists some semblance of national defense that means that any country is not likely to be invaded by a different country creates a lot of benefits for the people that live in there, even though they don't always pay directly into that. But more importantly, wouldn't necessarily want to pay directly into that, given that everyone else gets to do that for them. So that's an instance of something called a public good, right? Something that is not provided by the market. People don't necessarily buy directly, though you can talk about how you buy it indirectly by paying taxes. And it's kind of the opposite of, say, environmental damage, which hurts people that were not part of that transaction. So essentially now we're going to go into looking at certain types of externalities. But the general critique of a market when it comes to the general idea of the externality is that actually what you say is not true. Not everyone voluntarily opts into these transactions. Some people are sort of hidden parties to a transaction, and so either don't pay as much as they should or don't get compensated as much as they should. And so the first one, and this one is one of my favorites because it is so relevant in so many different motions where you wouldn't really expect it. So oftentimes there exist collective action problems or coordination problems within different industries, within different systems, more generally. And that's when it's in the interest of everyone to do or not do something, but unless if you can somehow compel everyone to do it, it's not in the interest of individuals to do that. So a good example of this is private schools. Let's assume for a second that we believe the thesis that private schools, are bad for meritocracy. It's unfair that some people, just by paying extra money, get to advance the social ladder, especially when those people didn't earn that money. Instead, it was their parents who they're randomly born into, that get to benefit. And so the world would be better if we didn't have private schools, because then everyone could be treated equally within the education system. I'm sure lots of British middle-class parents believe that, yet still will send their kids to private school. Why is that? Because you might believe that the world would be better if no one sent their kid to private school, but, given that all these other people do, if you don't send your kid to private school, one, you've done nothing to the system to disrupt it. I mean, you're just one person out of millions. But two, you've just screwed over your own kid, right? Because a lot of the reason why private schools are good is because they provide relative advantages to people. That a lot of people get to concentrate there and benefit as a result of that. That you develop kind of networks there that will help you out in the future. So if your kid doesn't go, your kid is left worse off, and there's all these other kids that have benefited at the expense of yours. So you wouldn't do that, right? Maybe you'd campaign for the abolition of private schools, but you wouldn't want to do that individually. Going back to the issue of the environment, one of the biggest reasons why virtually no country was abiding by the Kyoto Protocol, they wouldn't limit their greenhouse gas emissions, they wouldn't otherwise impose necessary environmental regulations, was because America and China had not ratified it. So if I, as Germany, know that the world will be better if we all get to cut our emissions, because, Bangladesh isn't going to flood, and food isn't going to become 10 times as expensive, and the climate's not going to be fucked up, and a lot of people won't die, and it's not going to cost a lot more money to just exist as a human being in the world. I mean, sure, the world would be better if all of us cut greenhouse gas emissions, but if I, as relatively small Germany, get to cut emissions, get to impose additional costs on my people and on companies here, but the biggest polluters, America and China, don't do it. I mean, sure, me cutting emissions is going to have a small marginal impact on the overall thing, but most of the damage is going to come from these other players. And so if they're going to do it, why would I? There's no direct incentive for me to want to do that. And that's the reason why we have things like treaties. For certain things. Why, the Paris Accords, while criticized, actually were a huge step forward because they got, all the major countries to actually enter them and commit to making those greenhouse emission cuts, which means that now it is in everyone's interest to make those cuts because you know that everyone else is also on board, that no one's going to cheat, or at least that hopefully no one's going to cheat or otherwise gain at your expense for opting into that system. But the important thing about collective action problems that I've sort of indirectly highlighted is that if you leave a market to be free, if you don't somehow impose those collective actions, people won't do it, right? The market will not coordinate for those things, and so the system will be left worse off. If every individual had to somehow account for or provide for national defense, that would be very difficult, right? Because why would I pay £200 of extra tax, but Bob next to me doesn't? I mean, those £200 will go into protecting both of us because the army protects the overall border. So that's essentially a huge reason why the government does a lot of stuff. The existence of collective action problems in things like developing infrastructure, things like building roads or providing electricity, but also things like national defense and regulating companies in order to ensure whatever the optimal outcome might be. Does this make sense? Again, if it doesn't, that's fine. It's my fault, not yours. No? Okay, cool. So the next fundamental assumption that we want to critique, that free markets kind of assume, is that people make rational choices, Again, going back to that initial thing about entering into voluntary consensual transactions because both parties will be best off. I mean, that assumes that I can, run that analysis in my head and figure out the costs, figure out the benefits, figure out how to weigh them, and decide whether or not I'm going to be left net positive or net negative, and so I should do or not do that particular thing. But often individuals don't necessarily have that rationality that's necessary to make those judgments. And this is where a lot of behavioral economics becomes relevant, because we see that very small things that don't really affect the overall costs and benefits of engaging in a particular transaction can actually have a huge positive or negative impact on people in in terms of whether or not they do certain things. Or other times where we just see people having preferences that do want them to do things that might hurt them. And a lot of debates are essentially about this. Like, should the government decide what is the correct thing to do and say, you are irrational, and therefore, if you're not going to stop on your own, we're going to stop you instead, and do, for example, things like ban certain goods or services, or put an extra tax on things like sugary drinks, or should it not? Should it acknowledge that people should be able to express their preferences, even if that might seem an irrational thing to do? Becky?
How do you analyse, like, not just that people act against their own self-interest, but, like, in a specific way they will act against their own self-interest? Is that a thing you can do?
I mean, it depends what the... Do you have an example?
Not,
I'm very bad with coming up with examples on the spot.
People voting for Donald Trump?
Smoking.
No, that's the voting for Brexit.
I'm trying to understand exactly what you're looking
yeah, people
for.
voting Brexit. Like, how do you analyse the way in which... Is there any way to analyse that someone will act in a way that is different to their self-interest, basically?
Well, so for example, let's assume that the objectively correct answer to Brexit is that it's against your interests as a British person. Though, again, remember that people have different preferences, and so they can be looking at the same exact situation, but be weighing things up super differently. Right? So if I tell you, if you vote for Brexit, your salary will become lower, you might lose your job, goods and services will be more expensive, so your cost of living will go up, but there's going to be fewer immigrants coming in, and you're going to have that feeling of control. Now, to someone who I think... To someone who I consider a rational person, they would firstly say, control, whatever, like, as if that changes. And why should I really care? On either case, there's some government and bound by various sorts of treaties and other limitations that control stuff. I don't really gain much more control. If anything, I'll have less control because I'll have less disposable income. I might lose my job. That seems like a worse situation. And so I'd preference those economic impacts on my life, but also the life of other people in my country a lot more heavily. But if I was someone whose preferences were skewed for one of two reasons, I might vote differently. So the first reason might be I just care a lot more about control than you do, or I care a lot more about national identity than you do, and I don't want to see it eroded against some vague European identity. I might just not want immigrants coming into my country, even if they make people economically better off. If those preferences are much stronger in my head, I mean, sure, I would prefer not to lose my job as well, but the opportunity cost is too high because I care a lot more, though not necessarily in pound terms, about national identity. Though maybe also in that, maybe donated lots of money to Nigel Farage's campaign. But the second reason why people, and we're going to go on this in a bit, but the second reason why people might be irrational in that way is because it's not always easy to not decide how to weigh up. That you can decide based on your preferences, but to figure out what it is that you're weighing up. So to understand the economic impacts, you need to have a particular understanding of how things work. You need to be able to, at the very least, understand what people on the media are saying when they explain that, Brexit will lead to economic destruction, rather than not really understand it and buy into the thing that, affirms all your other beliefs and say, no, we'll be better off. We'll make new deals. We'll make trade deals with all the countries. Trump will trade with us. India will trade with us. If you were able to look at that more critically, if you knew more about economics or about politics or about something else, you might realize that actually those things probably won't happen, or they probably won't happen to the extent that they will save the British economy. But until you have those kind of tools, that might either be knowledge, but it also might just be like cognitive capacity. You know, again, all those are factors that play in. And I think more often it's not, you know, raw cognitive capacity, you know, are you clever, are you dumb, but it's more about all the other things that inform those. It's about the kind of worldview that you have that then shapes your preferences. It's about the other things that you know about and how they might provide conflicting evidence, and you'll err on the side of the things that you already know. Or it might just be that, you know, you just are racist, and so that preference is really strong. And so this is the related one, right? So sometimes you just lack information that is necessary for making an informed choice, and a lot of debates tend to be about that, not about whether or not choice is good and whether choice should be left to individuals, but whether or not it's a meaningful choice, whether or not it's a choice that you've actually consented into, or if it's a choice that you think you've consented into, but you're not actually sure what it is that you have consented to doing. So, in theory, a consumer has perfect access to information, and they're able to perfectly then weigh things up because they're perfectly rational, and the system gets to perfectly provide them because there's no collective action problem, and everything is efficient and nice. But often that's not the case, right? Often you don't have the necessary information in order to make an informed decision. I mean, if you look at lots of things, especially as they would have been in the past, when companies weren't forced to be as transparent about things, when you weren't able to find out, say, how is this food actually made, or, you know, is this company making tons of profit and completely ripping me off, or is this car actually slightly used, or has the used car salesman just gone and sort of moved the clock back? You don't know all those things, and so you might make the wrong decision. That's the reason why very often we force companies or individuals or in some other way relevant parties to disclose a lot of that information. So the guy who won the Nobel Prize for essentially chatting about this, talking about informational asymmetries, where one side has access to a lot more information than the other, did talk a lot about the example of the used car I gave, because people would go to buy a used car, and essentially they would always pay the same price, even if the car was sold as, you know, slightly used or really, really used, and that price would be really high, as if all cars were very used. And that doesn't make sense, right? Surely you'd want to spend more money for the car that is that's barely been used, because it has a lot more mileage to go. But because you don't know if that's the case, because the salesman would just go back and dial the clock back, you weren't able to make that informed decision, even though the person selling it to you actually knew exactly how much the car was worth. And so you didn't make efficient transactions there. Customers were being ripped off. The other thing is, and it's essentially, again, relevant or related to this problem of lacking information. It comes up very often, primarily in debates about banking, is that of moral hazard. So, in simple terms, moral hazard is when because someone else is bearing the negative cost of me doing something risky, I don't attach the same kind of premium to that risk as I should. So normally I'd be very careful and always make sure to dress up and take my vitamin pills, and otherwise try and make sure that I never get sick, right? Because if I got sick, I'd have to pay lots of money to go to the hospital, or at least that's what someone living in the US would be doing. But if I get health insurance, or if healthcare is completely free, maybe I'll be a bit less careful about that, because I know that, you know, a trip to the hospital or a trip to the doctor is not going to cost me $500. Obviously, there's countless other reasons why people would want to avoid getting sick, so it's not necessarily the best example. But it sort of highlights why when someone else bears the costs of you suffering in some way, especially if it's a financial way, and someone's bearing the financial cost of that, then you are less averse to doing that. So, and the example that is sort of very common here is when banks know that they are too big to fail, that if one bank collapses, the entire system gets contaminated and we enter a depression, and that therefore governments will always step in to bail that bank out. In other words, to give it lots of money to avoid that collapse. You might think that in some ways that creates a perverse incentive for that bank, because it knows that actually it can be more risky in its transactions, and more risk here means more profit or greater chance of profit, because it knows that if things go well, if you're lucky, if the risky transactions pay off, you'll make a lot of money. If they don't, normally you'd be screwed, and about to go bankrupt. But if that situation doesn't exist anymore because the government will step in, why wouldn't you do it? I mean, best case scenario, lots of money. Worst case scenario, you lose a little bit of money. But, when you weigh things up, it makes a lot more sense to go for the risky option. So you go for the risky option. Becky, did you have a question?
Yeah, so in the health insurance example, so you say that moral hazard is when someone else is bearing the brunt of your action. Who is that in the example of the health insurance?
It's the insurance company, right? Because I'll pay the insurance company $50 a month, but I'll be insured for up to, $100,000 of damage. So in reality, I can live my entire life, and as long as I, need serious surgery once, I've more than enough paid the money, or received the money I've paid. Again, I don't think health insurance is a perfect example, but if we flip it and think of a positive case of moral hazard relating to healthcare, and again look at the U.S. So a lot of people will not go to the hospital because it's incredibly expensive. Like literally, a bone fracture is going to cost you $3,000 because it's like X-ray $1,000, and you're like, no way that costs you that much, but they get to charge you because of how constrained supply and demand is, but also how it's not very easy to shop for healthcare because you need to go to the hospital. You can't exactly go and figure out which one's cheaper, and they all benefit from that. Essentially, that collective action problem that you have on the consumer side, and they get to charge high prices. That and a few other reasons related to bargaining. But essentially if people won't go to the hospital and also won't pay for healthcare insurance, because that too is really, really expensive, wouldn't it be better if we just gave it to them for free? Because then they would actually, go to the hospital when they needed to, get that kind of lower level preventative healthcare or non-super serious treatment, as opposed to get really sick and have to go to A&E. Right? That's why, for example, I can't remember the exact wording of the motion, but there was a motion about, I think it may have been Imperial novices. It was one of the novice tournaments this year, I think, or last year. They all merge into my mind after a while. There was a motion about giving homeless people free stuff, giving them free housing, sometimes giving them free money on top of that, or this other motion, again about homelessness, that was just about creating houses for homeless people where they could freely drink if they want to there, whereas normally under status quo, to qualify for those kinds of benefits, you need to prove sobriety, you need to sometimes prove that you're looking for a job. And you'd think, why would you do that? And the answer is because that way you can provide them, you can also have doctors in those places. You can provide them with preventative care and support before they reach the stage where they need to go into A&E, because that is a lot more expensive, right? A&E is much, much more expensive than your kind of routine checkup or less surgeon operation or treatment. And so in that sense, because of a positive instance, essentially, of moral hazard, or something like moral hazard, the market isn't efficient at providing the thing, so the government stepping in is the better outcome. Right. The next thing I want us to look at, we've kind of touched on this anyway, though, is just cases when there's not enough competition, essentially. Cases where either artificially or naturally there just aren't that many players within a given industry. When that happens, actually it's not your incentive to lower the price as much as possible, to lower the cost of production as much as possible, to perhaps increase the quality of what you're providing because there's no one you're competing against, or because there's not enough others that compete against you that it becomes a serious problem. And often, either explicitly or implicitly, you actually strike deals with those other players and say, I mean, we could all have a price war and lower our price from 150 down to 80, but then we'd all be worse off. It seems like we have a collective action here, a collective action problem here. When there's few players, it's relatively easy to coordinate. That's what, for example, OPEC is. So not all, but most oil exporting countries have their little cartel where they will meet every year and agree on what price they should sell oil at, on how much oil they should dig out of the ground, and therefore how much supply should there be. And they're not optimizing for, what will help most people heat their houses at night and in the cold. No, they do it based on how can we maximize how much profit we're all making. So they will artificially limit the supply. And one of the reasons why the price of oil has gone down massively in the last 3 years is because a new player entered that market and had lots of oil and was not part of OPEC, so could freely charge less and get people to buy their oil rather than OPEC's oil. That player was the US, because they developed fracking technology, right? They developed a new way to access untapped resources, and they could then sell them for cheaper. And they've kind of fucked over international markets, in some ways positively, in some ways negatively. Definitely negatively if you're Saudi Arabia or Russia, or Venezuela. And they've disrupted them in that way. But again, without that, even with that disruption, it's still an oligopoly. Oil is still really expensive. In some cases, you can defend monopolies and oligopolies by doing something like what I was doing with healthcare companies, by saying, look, in some industries, research and development is super important, and therefore it's super important that each player makes a lot of profit, because then they can reinvest that into developing, new drugs, new electronics technology, the technology to take us to the moon and Mars, or whatever it might be that we're debating about. And on the other side, you criticize it by explaining how competition could lead to those things, but better, right? People would still compete over who innovates the best, but they'd keep less of the money. More of it would go into consumers' pockets because, they'd be paying less for the thing or be getting a better thing because of better innovation. Yeah?
What if the company that has the monopoly is still doing all the innovation stuff? I mean, it doesn't have to entirely be bad. So, for example, an example would be something like Singapore, where they do have state-owned, a lot of stuff is state-owned, but at the same time, they are taking care of their citizens. It's not all negative.
Yeah.
State-owned is kind of different, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's two things to note here. The first is that when things are state-owned, the incentives are different, right? So with private firms, in most cases, profitability is the key thing you care about. Sometimes even private companies also care about other things. See, for example, why is my mind frozen? What's the guy's name? Tesla guy. Elon Musk. I don't know why I forgot that. Elon Musk, right, a couple of years ago, released all of his solar, or a lot of his intellectual property on solar and batteries, and things related to essentially battery electric vehicles to the public domain, right? He gave up on the patents that he had. And that's because he didn't care about his short-term profitability as much as creating a wider industry for these kinds of goods. Because now a lot of companies, because competition now became possible, because they didn't have that barrier of you need to invest billions to develop your own intellectual property, to innovate on your own. Instead, they got them for free, now all those companies get created, now an entire industry gets created. Because, I mean, why would people buy Tesla cars if there's only 30 electric charging points in your state? People wouldn't do that, right? Only crazy people would buy that with money to waste. But if there's an entire industry of cheap, affordable electric vehicles, then there's also a secondary industry of cheap, affordable charging stations all over the country. And that then means that it's actually realistic to buy an electric car, even though it has a short range, because you can charge it quickly, you can charge it in many places. Because of innovation, charging takes a few seconds or minutes instead of a few hours, and so it becomes long-term viable, but also better for the environment. The second thing about what Vaibhav said is that often, even privately owned monopolistic companies obviously will still spend some of their money on research and development. Very often because it's that research and development that keeps them a monopoly, right? The fact that they're the only ones that can effectively produce something, or that they're the only of a few companies that can effectively, make processors. I mean, it used to be more companies. Now it's Intel. Now it's mainly Intel. No, it's not. That information is a few years out of date. Yeah, like CPUs, but I forget their name.
AMD.
Radio.
AMD.
No, AMD are the ones that are kind of screwed over. The one, I forget its name. The company that makes the chips that go into iPhones and all other ones. Right. No.
Snapdragon.
Oh, he's one of the people who fabricate the chips.
Yes.
TSMC.
Yes.
And Lenovo and Samsung and Intel, they do the fabrication.
Okay.
TSMC.
I'm thinking of a different example than what you guys are talking about, I think. But it doesn't really matter, right? Oh, I was thinking of ARM, right? That's the company. That was TSMC. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. Often R&D will be the thing that keeps you on top. But again, that only incentivizes you to do certain types of R&D and only to a certain extent, because you're still optimizing not for, how do we make everyone better off, but instead how do we make our business best off. Right. At this point, I want to go into how we can correct some of these failures, even though I've touched on them. But I know we're also running a bit late because I talk more than I should. Is it okay to go on, or should we have the debate? Bruce?
It's probably... no, you can have... we're going to do 5 and 5, so you can have, 5 more minutes.
Okay, it's a short section anyway. So the first broad way of correcting these failures is government intervention. And here I've just listed 2 key ways in which it's kind of sucky. But obviously there's a lot of instances in which it works. So the first issue is inefficiency, that all those incentives that I was talking about that lead to all those positive behaviors get constrained when the government puts up regulation, or when the government might nationalize a particular industry or put other kinds of limits, right? Because often they will increase the costs that it takes to run your company, which means that fewer companies can compete because not everyone, is as cost efficient, or it might mean that the overall quality gets to be worse off as a result. By the way, Bruce, I'm not staying for the debate, so don't count me for that. I need to go back and do work. And the second kind of general problem is that governments often have incentives that in BP debating we can sometimes idealize and pretend they are perfect and pretend that we have perfect control over them. But often they can be negative in various ways. But also government regulation and the government as a regulator is often very susceptible to being controlled either by the private companies it's supposed to be regulating or by someone else who might have a vested interest that, again, goes against the public interest. Sure, banking regulation can be very useful, right? It's useful because it reduces risk in the system, it reduces the chances of a crash or depression or of irresponsible lending that might lead to problems, people losing their savings or their pensions. All those things seem good. But equally, if government's financial regulation also raises the barriers to entering the financial services industry. So in other words, I might have like a very good business model or just a better way to do something related to financial services. Like we see lots of fintech startups coming now, but often I get blocked because of those regulations that might exist, because they were either designed for an older age where the kind of thing that we're now able to provide wasn't possible, or because they are specifically propped up by a government that is supported by the traditional banks that don't want to see their business disrupted, don't want to lose their oligopoly and their profit to other startups or just generally other banks coming in. That means that lobbying and government intervention can be questionable, right? Because, I could go into more detail, but I think it's the kind of argument you're familiar with about how through lobbying you can influence government in order to get it to do what you, as a special interest group, say the banks or the major banks want you to do, as opposed to what the people may want the government to do. This one I'm not going to go into, but I will upload the slides. And you can both see this kind of outline of why two different ways of correcting externalities have positive and negative aspects, but also I'm going to upload essentially the notes underneath, which is a short part of an essay I wrote that essentially goes through this and should be quite useful. But essentially, in very brief terms, when government intervenes, it can often do so in very direct and blunt ways by imposing strict regulations, or it can create more market-friendly and market-based systems, like, say, creating tradable quotas for fishing, as opposed to saying no fisherman can fish more than X amount a year, or no one can fish except for, these few weeks during the year, otherwise we'd have overfishing. In general, this is much easier to implement, but often leads to either worse outcomes or at least not ideal outcomes. This one, at its best, can lead to far more efficient and sustainable systems, but it's really hard to implement and often hard to kind of monitor and introduce. And I think that's it. Yes. Are there any questions? Okay.